Welcome to Four Quarter Lives, a podcast exploring the profound impact of longer lives and careers on everything: countries, companies, couples, and careers. I'm Avivah Wittenberg-Cox, and on this week's Four Quarter Lives, we're diving into a milestone many of us will experience, if we're lucky: grandparenting. But as my guest today makes clear, this isn't just a cozy, nostalgic role. It's an entirely new life chapter filled with love, surprises, and a redesign of family systems. I'm joined by Terri Apter, a psychologist and acclaimed author who has spent decades studying family relationships, from mothers and daughters to siblings and in-laws. And now in her latest book, Grandparenting, the complex and evolving role of grandparents. Terri brings deep insight into what it means to be a grandparent today. She explores how this experience transforms not just our relationship with grandchildren, but with our own children and even with ourselves. From the emotional rewiring that happens in our brains to the subtle generational tensions over parenting styles, we'll unpack the real dynamics of modern grandparenting. We'll also discuss three types of grandmothers she identifies: the feminist grandmothers stepping in to support their daughters' careers, the radical grandmothers fearlessly protecting their newfound independence, and the subversive grandmothers who take a more detached but often thought-provoking role in their grandchild's lives. And of course, what about grandfathers? Are they discovering new depths of love and family involvement in their second round at fatherhood? If you're a grandparent, a parent, or simply curious about how multi-generational families are shaping the future, you don't want to miss this conversation. Let's get started. Welcome, Terri Apter, to Four Quarter Lives. Delighted to have you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here and to talk about grandparenting.
Grandparenting, and a wonderful book it is that I've already bought in multiple copies and am gifting to all my friends, emerging into this new human species of grandparent. But before we launch into this book, I'd love to see a little bit the overview of your oeuvre. You've been writing many books for many years, and you've written extensively, really, with a focus on family relationships.
That's right, yes.
Mothers and daughters to in-laws, and now you've launched into grandparents. So is there a red thread? What's the focus over time? How would you describe your writing journey?
Right. Okay. So if we start at the beginning, for my first project of this kind, I was looking at mothers and teenage daughters, and I wanted to watch them interacting in situ. I wanted to see, I knew the theories about what adolescents were supposed to feel about their parents. Anna Freud described adolescence as a parent-child version of divorce, but the teen was actually trying to sever the relationship with the parent. And this is embedded in, even still today, it's embedded in a lot of the things we say teens are trying to separate. What I found just by being in their homes, watching them interact, debriefing them maybe after a session, and in particular paying great attention to their arguments, of which there were many. And what I saw was that teen girls were not trying to sever relationships with a mother. They were trying to revitalize it. They were trying to remind the mother that this is something that has to be kept up to date, that I'm not the little girl you think you know. You have to take a new look at me. And in arguing, it's a way of sort of shaking her into a new awareness of how much the teen has changed. So I found that just by observing people interacting in families, taking a very close look at what they said, because prior to being a psychologist, I was a literary critic, an academic in literature. So the word was very important. And I saw if you bring this attention, this focus to what people are actually saying and what are their aims, that you can find out a great deal that makes a lot of sense. It has a huge amount of resonance to other people, but is very different from established theories about what's going on. So it was this that set me on the journey of looking at families in different ways. And there were
literary criticism of life.
Yes, or close textual reading of human speech. And as you say, I've looked at it, mothers and daughters, and more generally, teens and parents. What are their aims? Also interested in siblings. I thought when I wrote my last book, which was once again on teens and parents and bringing into these my very domestic scale of study, a lot of the neurobiology that has been done over the past 15 years, matching that up with what I found. I thought that would be my last book. But then I became a grandparent, and I realized that though there had been so much done to challenge the acceptable or expected structure of parents. Parents don't have to be married. There doesn't have to be two of them. They can be any gender whatsoever. It doesn't affect the well-being of the children. What affects the well-being of the children is the sense of belonging and love and support. So lots of challenge about what parents, the nuclear family could look like, but very little attention to how multi-generational families and how important grandparents were to grandchildren. So, I noted this, but I didn't actually think about writing it until I was approached by an editor who said she had been she was really anxious to write a book about grandparents, and she had been told by someone else at her publishing house who had worked with me, previously, that I was the person to write this. And what convinced me to go ahead with this was that she was not a grandparent. She was a mother with very young children. And it was her mother-in-law who allowed her to return to work full-time after she had her children. But the grandmother, being a facilitator, was also not easy. She didn't tell me in any detail. She's not in the book. But she was clearly interested in the challenges of navigating these three generations. And so I thought, well, if parents are interested in it, that really opens up the subject, because instead of it being sort of just us and positioning grandparents in a cozy light, this was bringing it right back into the kind of family dynamics that interested me.
What was the greatest surprise, before we launch into all the subtleties of the various grandparenting adult-children relationships you dissect so beautifully in the book? You have, I think, half a dozen grandchildren of your own. What surprised you most about this graduate experience of human life?
This new chapter in love, which is
chapter in love.
Yes. So
it's a very new chapter. It's very how much of a new chapter it is.
Yes. So you become a grandparent, and
nobody asks you about it.
No, but that's like becoming an in-law as well, in a way.
Sometimes they ask.
Sometimes you can see it coming, and that's true in a way of becoming a grandparent. But what you don't realize, or what I didn't realize, was how it changed my relationship with every member of the family. So I was now not only a mother of an adult child, and I thought over the years, had cracked that. I knew how to be a mother of people who were adults. There was a new equality there. But now I was also a mother of a mother. And that also is a new equality. We both understand this experience. My daughter said to me, I didn't realize I'd love him so much. And I think, well, yes, and now you know how I felt, and now you know why I was so, protective and engaged, and it was so difficult, for me to step away. Also, there's a different relationship with a son-in-law or, whatever the in-law is, the other parent, because you now have a great deal of common focus on and genetic investment in the same being, but you still might have very different views about what you want for this child.
Yeah, it's like you discover your own children in an entirely new role.
Yes. Yeah. And a lot of people say that one of the greatest pleasures of being a grandparent is seeing my child become a parent. And I worried about the things I didn't do, some of the things I did. I'm aware of the shortcomings as a parent, and I've been reminded by my own child over the years of my shortcomings. But seeing them be such a parent and respond so positively and fully to their child, I feel I must have done okay. So that's a good thing, though that isn't always a steady state, because your child as parent, may remind you that you didn't get things right and they don't want their children to suffer the same kind of whatever it is, teasing, pressure, restrictions, or unboundariedness that they themselves felt. Yeah. And they'll remind you of that. And that
they're going to try and fix your script the way they experienced it.
They are. Yes. They'll probably want your input, because that's a big thing. Working parents today are very overstretched, and daughters in particular, women in particular, understand that having a child can pull back, can impede their career ambitions. And there's nothing like a grandmother who will step in and offer support in childcare to help that along the way. So they'll want input. Yes, go on.
Let me skip into that a bit. I'm going to go down some of these questions. You've done a wonderful job of kind of scoping out how feminism has changed parenting. And you segment grandparents, and particularly grandmothers, into these three groups: the feminist, the radical, and the subversive, which I just love. Can you walk us through a little bit how it plays out, and how suddenly all us grandmothers find ourselves in a very familiar choice?
Yes. Okay. So one of the key features of this generation of grandparents, particularly, I'm talking about, the grandparents I looked at in Europe, in the UK, and in the US. This is a generation who spearheaded changes in gender roles and gender identity, what it is appropriate to expect from a woman. And we certainly pushed back against assumptions that we should be the ones to care for the children. We should sacrifice or not even have any ambition, anxiety ourselves in the wider world. What we should do is look after our family. So very much challenging this. And we continue to challenge it. We thought the hard work of that was done when our children were grown. I've done it, I've managed it, and now this is my time, full steam ahead to whatever it is I want to do. It can be career, it can be adventure, it can be just developing my own interests, it can be having fun in new ways. But you see particularly your daughter, but it was often daughters-in-law, become parents, and you see that suddenly they realize that being a mother makes them a different kind of employee. Unlike my generation, were very aware of the biases that we would face in the workplace as working mothers. this younger generation of parents often believes that there isn't, oh yes, mom, you didn't have maternity leave, you didn't have all of these protections, legal protections, but we do, we're okay. And my partner knows that he's going to pitch in and do 50-50. So it's so very different.
Yeah, it's all over. We won.
Yeah, it's all over. However, you look at women in the workforce, women who have made progression in their careers between the ages of 30 and 40, and you will hear how they notice how differently an employer looks at a man who has become a father. Oh, he's new maturity, he's likely to feel more motivated, take on more responsibility, let's promote him. Woman comes back from maternity leave, oh, let's protect her. Not ready yet. Let's see how it goes. It wouldn't be fair to her,
staff role rather than a line job.
Yeah. So they feel a pressure to say, take another look at me. I'm okay. But to do that, they often need extra support. And family support is so good. First, it's usually free, at least to them. It often has costs to grandparents who might forego part of their own careers. They might travel. But anyway, to the parent, it's usually free or very cost effective. And what has surprised so many people is that it's the committed feminists who, as grandmothers, step in to help their daughter or daughter-in-law with these caring roles, because they say that's a way to protect their feminist legacy.
Right.
When they talk about the costs of themselves, they look at the relative costs. Well, it isn't such a hit to my career if I don't take on this client, if I don't go to this conference, if I don't get this project in. But to a daughter or daughter-in-law who is 35 or 40, that's going to be a big hit, so I want to do that. Now, there are also grandmothers who say, no way. I mean, so much of my life has been taken up complying with the assumption that I'm going to be looking after other people, that my needs are less important than other people's needs. And I call these women radical grandmothers because what they're doing is radical for them. They have been committed to being the one to look after other people. And now in midlife, they can sort of take a breather. They may have a little bit more material comfort or financial stability than they did in their 20s. And they want to be able to do things for themselves, whatever it is. It could be a career, it could be professional, but it could also be, I want to travel. And I don't want the mental load of all of this. And I want to be able to wake up each day and decide what I'm going to do. And they can be extremely irritated when they see friends of theirs who they have always thought of as staunch feminists stepping back into these caring roles. Yeah. And so you probably remember the mummy wars of the 1980s and 90s, where women who worked were pitted against women who didn't work, or who didn't work outside the home. And, who was doing what, who was a better person.
Yeah, the moral upper hand. Yep.
Yeah. So here it isn't quite as tight a battle, but it seems to ignite extreme annoyance in some radical grandmothers who say, my so-called feminist friends are wasting their lives. They're undermining me in a way. They're setting an example I don't want to follow. And I think, once again, just as grandmothers, once again, were pushed into a position in which we have to think about, what's selfish versus selfless? What is appropriate for me to give to other people? When is it appropriate for me to say no and think about only my well-being? we thought we left that behind, but we're stuck with that again. And we also have to be tolerant, to remind ourselves again that we have to be tolerant of other people's decisions. That in one context, it really is too much. You are asking too much of me to take on, even one day a week. It's just too much. That's not the mindset I want. Versus another who says, well, I can do this, and therefore, from my point of view, this is protecting my feminist legacy. Whereas the radical grandmother,
feminists are the ones who are basically fighting the fight again, but on behalf of their own daughters or daughters. So they take on this caring role. The radicals are the ones who may have done it for their own. I'll say, no way, this is my time, and I'm not going back into that expectation. So what's the third is a sort of subversive.
Yes, and I think that any kind of grandparent will probably have a little bit of a subversive element in her. No one will tell you this but me. Subversive.
No, I'm right there with you, I think.
But subversive grandmothers are usually still so engaged in whatever it is they're doing in their own lives that they're not playing with these choices. They're not confronting them. And they're often less engaged with the newborn than they are. They're very keen to interact with the older children. They can be just a little bit older. They can be 7 or 8. And what they tend to do is say, I want to spend time with you. You're going to do what I do. So I'm going to, if I'm a barrister, you're going to observe a law court. You're going to have joined this dining club. We're going to talk about this. We're going to, I'm going to introduce you to my world. And also they think that it's very important to introduce them to unofficial knowledge, what other people won't tell you. It's really important for you to know that people aren't always nice, that you can't always expect fairness, that, sometimes you have to learn how to lie. Sometimes you have to learn how to be less nice than you want to be and, face up to what you want and out of the situation rather than be nice and generous like you're always told you should be. So subversive.
Your parents are preaching. So basically, subversive is ready to self-define and contradict, perhaps, the parents.
Absolutely, yes. And you can see how subversive grandparents are probably a joy to grandchildren and rather a mixed bag to the parents.
Yeah, absolutely. So grandparenting, that is such a wonderful, sort of feminist timeline of evolutions of, each of the last century probably worth of women and roles. Another way that grandparenting, and probably that hasn't actually changed that much, is long-distance parenting. I'm imagining It's always been long-distance parenting. Now perhaps there's much more of it, and it's probably easier to bridge, I assume, with technology. What in between the faraways and the close bys?
Right. Okay, so close bys, are wonderful in many ways, but still mixed. So often a parent will say, oh, I'm so lucky the grandparents live close by. I couldn't do this if they didn't. On the other hand, they might say it's problematic they're close by, they're too interfering, they expect to be around, they expect to be included in so many things. So nothing is always good or always helpful. Long distance grandparenting does tend to pose challenges. Yes, of course, there's screen time, Zooming, and that can be very reassuring to grandparents just to be able to track what their grandchildren look like because they can change so quickly. Kids get very quickly impatient with conversations on Zoom. So, it will be almost a running by saying hi, hi. You can do it more in the very early years where your babe is in arms and, you're showing them, look what she can do. And they're quite compliant at that stage. Later on,
they can't run away.
they can't run away, but soon they will be able to run away. But I think technology can help grandparents who were managing long distance grandparenting, long distance engagement really well, would engage directly with the grandchild and not necessarily on a Zoom call. But one grandmother would text, this is my word for the week. What's your idea for the week? What are you doing? It can be little bits of checking in to see what they're doing day to day and to show an interest in them, sending them photos of what they're doing. The grandparents can do that, or sending photos of, I saw that, this and thought of you. It can't make up for that in-person play and that imaginative intimacy you get when you're actually sharing a game with them and elaborating on any of their ideas. That is such an intimacy and delight to the grandchild, and also has a great benefit to the grandparent, because grandparents who engage with their children, say about once a week, have a much lower risk of dementia. And it's thought that this refreshing imaginative play is a good way of exercising the brain and making it more agile and helping it look at things in a different way. And there's also the physical bit, a kid wriggling on your lap or taking your hand. But so it is long distance, I think if you can get in visits where you are together for a certain amount of time, I think that has a lot of longevity.
So get on a plane.
Yeah.
I'm taking that to heart. You found that the brain reacts differently to grandchildren than to children. I found that absolutely fascinating. So what's the difference and how can we build on that?
Okay, so I'll tell you how this was found and what I think it means or what it might mean. So grandparents, and they had to be grandparents, and they had to have a child between the age of 2 and 12, something like that. And they were shown pictures of their grandchild and pictures of their parent and put in an fMRI scanner. This is a machine that looks at the blood flow in the brain, indicating which bits of the brain are most active. So when they looked at pictures of their children, there was a big activity in the parts of the brain that we think are associated with empathy, but cognitive empathy, that is, understanding what it is they're feeling and why, more analytical. Whereas when they looked at grandchildren, the empathic part of the brain that seemed to be most active was focused just on emotion, just on what the kid was feeling, and didn't have any adjustment in terms of, is this reasonable? Is there a way around this? Can we change this in some way? And the difference in that, the pure empathy of what you're feeling versus the more analytical empathy of, I feel for you, but is thought, when the researchers announce this, they say, so this explains why it is your grandparent gave you so much candy.
It's literally meant, and you can do anything you want.
You want it, you have it. And when people look at studies like this about what the brain's doing, they often think, that really explains it. This is a cause. But I think it's just a correlate. It's another way of saying, this is what grandparents do. This is how they feel. We sort of knew that anyway, but isn't it cool to look at these brain imaging and see what bits of the brain are active when they're doing what we know they do anyway? And I think that's the best way to look at these studies rather than say, oh, this causes it, they don't have any control over it. And it's also important to point out that in this study, there were variations, so not all grandparents are the same.
A related question. So we're talking here about spoiling kids, stereotype of the grandparent that gives them all they could possibly want. What I hear a lot from my grandparent circle is a lot of worry about parents being too permissive. And this intergenerational conversations about what's allowed, what's not, what boundaries. What did you find?
Okay, well, first of all, what I would say what I found was that there's always going to be some disagreement, some sort of misalignment. So some grandparents will say, too permissive, it drives me crazy the way her mother puts up with her when she procrastinates, when they have to get to swimming or to school or to whatever, and the kid is just saying, well, I just have to finish this, or I want to just watch this, or I don't like these shoes. The grandmother can say, look, she has to get to school, just get on with it and do it. Don't buy into this. But, there are equally grandparents who say it's such a regimented family, just such a regimental style. And you see the same kind of predictable misalignment in how to manage a tantrum. So I wouldn't say that one style, one approach is more common in grandparents versus parents. What I'd say is what's very common is the misalignment, whatever picture people are on. Partly with all this spread of diagnosis of some kind of discomfort or resistance or difficulty that a child has is more likely now by parents to be seen as an issue of the child's experience, which may or may not be ASD, autism spectrum disorder, or ADHD, something like that. And so what's important is to validate how the child feels rather than get to school on time.
Yeah. So in addition to this kind of intergenerational board or misalignment, as you very kindly call it, there must be enormous shifts also in intercultural parenting expectations and rules. Any general principles we can keep? Is the Anglo-Saxon world particular and different than other regions?
Oh, well, if you're looking in that broad way, Anglo-Saxon versus, let's say, in China and India. So it's often thought in the Anglo-Saxon world, that grandparenting is very different in Asian countries, that it's more embedded in the culture, and the grandparent, particularly the paternal grandmother, has a lot of control over the way the family is run. In fact, that is changing enormously and quickly. So in India, where you think that the Indian grandmother is the one who's always going to be involved, it's assumed she's going to be involved. Well, only 16% of families in India live in multi-generational homes. So that's a huge difference, that young people now want to live on their own, want control over their own income, over the way they live, and over their own children. So now what you're seeing is far more similarities in negotiating closeness and distance than I expected when I started this project. And in China, the same. What is very interesting in China, and maybe we'll come back to this, is that in most Chinese languages, there is no common word for grandmother. There's a different word for paternal grandmother and maternal grandmother because they're seen as so different. Again, it used to be thought that the paternal grandmother has a great deal of power in the family, and, domestically, she's the A woman. But now, once again, young parents want their own lives, want control over their own income and their own children. And there was a big shift from the importance of paternal grandmother to maternal grandmother in the 1950s and 60s, where suddenly all women under the age of 50 were required to work. I mean, this was incredibly important in driving the tiger economy of China, which we still see going today. And you see there's a pullback now as they're trying to get women back into the home. But that's recent and so far hasn't been very successful because it was so successful getting them into the workplace. But to get good jobs, they often had to leave their villages, go into the cities, and they, because of certain laws about relocation in China, they couldn't take their families, and it was the maternal grandmother who looked after the children while the women were working in good jobs in the cities. So, huge shifts. And I think that, one would have said 20 years ago that grandparents weren't key to family life here. And where they were key, that was more a working class thing than a very general thing. So if you look at Michael Young's work on kinship and family in the East End of London, this was written in 1959, and there the grandmother did have a lot of influence in the family. But now that influence is across class, partly because women are working, childcare is so expensive, housing is so expensive that it's more difficult to have help living within your home. The mothers are available and often a soft touch because, as I say, the grandmothers who are most aware of how difficult it is found it difficult themselves too and want to ease the new parents.
So we've been talking a lot about grandmothers.
Yes.
I'm curious.
Yeah.
Have you seen a parallel evolution in grandfathers? Are grandfathers also discovering perhaps the roles and love and time on family that they perhaps didn't have in their first iteration as fathers? Is that a...
Oh, yes, that is a thing.
A thing?
I mean, there's very little research on grandfathers. They're pretty much invisible in, research on multi-generation.
Why is that?
Well, their input hasn't been so important. It is important now. There are fathers who are the grandfathers who are looking after young children, who are helping their daughters advance in their career. They, like a grandmother, sees how difficult it is, and if able, will stand in. Grandmothers also find that it's an enormous help having their partner engage with anything they have to do. Just another pair of hands, maybe a little bit more arm strength, another person to play with, another person to distract, especially if you're looking after a baby, a toddler and a 7-year-old, someone who will attend to one while the grandmother is attending the other. And there were many grandmothers who said, he spends much more time with the grandchildren than he did with the children. And I wish I had been that insistent then. I wish I'd encouraged him as much then as I do now to do that. Another really surprising thing I found about grandfathers was that teens and teen boys in particular, you ask them, who do you trust most in the family? And they were very likely to say, Granddad. He's not going to be on my case. He's not going to ask too much of me. I mean, the grandmother, the emotional engagement is so sort of salient, so strong. that often teens think, what does she want from me? This grin, and she wants to hug me. Grandfathers are more easily laid back, just focusing on what they're doing together or on conversation, and very unlikely to judge or have views about, what they should be doing when. So teens are very, very responsive to that.
And maybe the last piece on the evolution of grandparenting I wanted to touch on that you mentioned is children who decide not to have children. There are a lot of wannabe grandparents who are tumbling fertility rates around the globe.
Yes.
Discovering that this dreamed of state they may not achieve.
Yes, there are other ways of engaging with young generations, and I think it is a feature of the phase of life in which you become a grandparent. One feature of that psychology is you want to contribute to younger generations. And there are many ways in which you can do that. So, you can go into schools, you can do community groups. There are neighborhoods in which grannies who aren't really grannies play a very important role. And in some, what we call rough areas, where there are enough grandparents to do that, they can be very effective in offering, a comfortable place to be other than on the street, where you can just hang out and regroup, and also where you can be monitored. And then you have, you may not have children, but your sister or your friend does. And a lot of people say it's enough that I'm a great aunt. That's enough for me.
Yeah.
So there are many ways of grandparenting and satisfying the needs that we have as grandparents without actually being a biological grandparent. And we shouldn't leave out step grandparents, because step grandparents are a huge group, and they often feel as attached as any biological grandparent.
Wonderful. Okay. You've done a beautiful job of kind of the analysis of trends in grandparenting up to today. If you had to predict the next big shift in this group, what might it be? Any ideas?
I think that it's going to become more and more important. I think once you lift the blinkers of ageism, assuming that the generation that is grandparents, that they're not interesting, that they're not dynamic, that they're not contributors, once you set that aside and see how important the multi-generational family is, even though it might not be in one household, then just becoming clear about how important that is, what the huge benefits are to the parents, to the grandchildren, and as I've said, to the grandparents themselves in terms of mental well-being and physical well-being, then that is something that is going to be more firmly established in our society. And wouldn't it be nice if there was some protection in law for grandparents to have access to grandchildren when the parents, for one reason or another, may be trying to block that?
Yeah, which you write about quite a bit in the book. So worth reading if there's estrangements anywhere in the family. So I'd like to conclude on, I would certainly recommend anybody who's becoming a grandparent to read this book as preparation, or a wonderful gift for new parents to give to their own parents. I think that's very wise of your very initial statement, is the awakening of why you wrote it was when the parents got in how to manage upwards through the generations. What would be one piece of advice you'd have for new grandparents? What should they be mindful of in this new role?
Okay, so I think what they should be mindful of is the intense focus that new parents have on their own child. They are watching the new child to understand how it's communicating its needs, what it's trying to get from them, how they can interact in a positive way. this relationship, this mutual watching, has been described as so intense and coordinated that you could call it a carefully choreographed dance. That's how it's been described. And sometimes the parent expects that their experience will be helpful in interpreting this, and they find instead that they're irritating the parent, they're stepping on something. And they experience this, as a rejection and often feel huffy. Well, okay, I'll leave, or I was only trying to help. And I think if they see that the new parents have to engage in this intense focus without distraction, that they will get a much better sense of how to step in and how to step out. And that will do an awful lot to ease these enormous changes in relationship that happen when a newcomer is brought into the family.
Wonderful. So grandparents, listen, leave room to your kids to parent in their own way. It's a wonderful, deep, and very complex relationship. And as you say, it redefines the role not only with your children, but with the entire family system. So you have helped us prepare and understand in a really concrete way. Curious, what's next for you, Terri? What comes after grandparenting? You thought your last book was your last book.
Yes.
The last book, or is there another one in the back of your mind?
Well, of course, in terms of my personal grandparenting, that's not going to come to an end until, I hope, the end of my life. In terms of writing, it's tricky. I'm so engaged with my grandchildren's way of seeing things that I'd love to find a way to write about that. So I think a lot of grandparents want to take up writing children's books. I don't think that would be mine, but there's something there that I'm playing with that hasn't really taken shape.
Grandchildren might be the next book.
Yes.
From their perspective.
Yeah, well, I do write about how grandchildren treasure their grandparents, how the way they feel cherished by a grandparent can last throughout their lives, and how family stories affect them. But yes, there's a lot of, I think I end the book talking about questions about what they'll remember. So maybe as a psychologist, it would be something along those lines. What effect do early relationships have on, their outlook and their personality and, how they develop? So that might be one area.
Wonderful. Legacies and imprints on little things. Yeah. A great way to end. Terri Apter, thank you so much for being with me. Thank you for writing Grandparenting.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
See you soon.
Yes.
For more thinking about the impact of our 4-quarter lives, you can read my column at Forbes and subscribe to my Elderberries newsletter on Substack. Let's design lives that aren't just longer, but better.